You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, the Supreme Court has just ruled 9-0 against removing Donald Trump from the ballot in accordance with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. What was the reasoning behind this?
So the reasoning is that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, says that if you took an oath previously to support the Constitution and you engage in insurrection, you are disqualified. But Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says basically only Congress can make that decision. They can pass legislation that implements the disqualification. So plain and simple, the Supreme Court said the states can't do it, even if somebody is an adjudicated insurrectionist, as Donald Trump is in the courts of Colorado, doesn't matter. Only Congress can pass legislation setting out how it is one goes about disqualifying an insurrectionist, and they haven't done it. So here we are.
Well, help me understand this, because isn't it already clear in the plain text of the Constitution what needs to be done? Like isn't that part already laid out? Why does the court need Congress to tell it how to enforce the Constitution if it's already plain as day?
One thing I can promise you, Brian, is I will not be able to help you understand this. As a trial lawyer for 30 years, my juries would look to me like, Prosecutor Kirshner, can you please explain this? And I would often say, I can't explain the inexplicable because, Brian, as you say, the 14th Amendment couldn't be more clear. If you took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution and you engage in insurrection, and Donald Trump did, we saw it with our own eyes, and courts and secretaries of state have ruled that he did, you are disqualified.
Right.
So I can't explain how it is. The Supreme Court said, no, 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 no. There's far more to it than that. Well, there actually shouldn't be. The reason I say there shouldn't be is because the Constitution disqualifies people for other reasons. You're not yet 35 years old. You're not a natural born citizen. You're not a resident of the United States for 14 years. You have held the office of the presidency twice previously. You're disqualified. And the 14th Amendment, Section 3, speaks in clear, direct, unequivocal language, plain English. Donald Trump is disqualified. So how they can say, no, what we're going to need here is for Congress to get together, put a pin in that, and come up with legislation so all of this can be sorted out and applied consistently, not a state by state basis. Now, Brian, I am not all that comforted that the Supreme Court just told us all that this decision, whether to disqualify an insurrectionist from retaking the reins of federal power, we're going to leave it up to folks like Jim Jordan and James Comer and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other House Republicans to work on legislation and then ultimately to vote that, oh, well, Donald Trump is an insurrectionist, so he certainly can't be president again. That's especially challenging when Congress is full of insurrectionists. They would be voting against their own interests, both specifically and atmospherically, if they passed legislation implementing the disqualification. This, unfortunately, Brian, I say this with no glee. I don't say it casually. I don't say it cavalierly. We are a failed government in some of the arenas that success matters most. We're not succeeding. We're not capable of succeeding. And I think this unanimous Supreme Court opinion, 9-0. Now, there are some dissents where they call Donald Trump out as being a stone cold insurrectionist, but it was 9-0 on the decision that only Congress can do it. And they have to get to work and pass some legislation to make it a reality, which we all know will not happen. A 9-0 decision means it's the law of the land, right? Whether it's right or wrong doesn't really matter. It's the unanimous law of the land and a unanimous interpretation of the Constitution, and we are stuck with it. There is no appeal from a Supreme Court ruling. Where does that leave us, Brian? We both know where it leaves us. Our viewers know where it leaves us. The rule of law won't save us. The courts won't save us. Congress won't save us. We will save us by getting to the polls in November in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal. We are the only ones who can save us. We did it in 2020. We're going to do it again in November 2024.
Perfectly put. Glenn, to your earlier point about the fact that this is a 9-0 unanimous decision, what was your reaction to seeing that the liberal justices signed on to this?
You know, it makes it clear to me that they all agreed with the constitutional interpretation. And, you know, when you read the Constitution and when you read all of the provisions of the 14th Amendment, I can see their rationale. But when they interpret the Constitution in a way that will sort of clear the path for an adjudicated insurrectionist to retake the reins of federal power, something seems to be off. You know, they could have interpreted the Constitution in other ways, but the reality is when you get 9 justices, you know, left, right, and center, to the extent there are any in the center these days, who all agree that no, this is the best, most appropriate interpretation of the Constitution's disqualification clause and the procedures necessary to disqualify a candidate for federal office, you know, we're stuck with that. And I don't even know that I disagree with the rationale when you read through the opinion and the dissents. I disagree with the result, you know, this sort of blind following of certain words and provisions. If it produces an absurd result, indeed a democracy-ending result, a result that may give the reins of federal power back to an avowed day one dictator, it feels like something's off.
To that point, is the court basically saying that if a 14-year-old came before them and said that I should be allowed to run for president, and without a law on the books, that the Supreme Court would then say, yep, I guess you can run for president. If there's no specific law saying that you can't, you're all good to go. Like, we can't, our hands are tied. We can't do anything about it. We can't enforce the provision of the Constitution that says you have to be 35 years old to run for president.
No, I think it's because the disqualification clause is found in the 14th Amendment, which was an amendment designed to basically prohibit the states from doing certain things. You know, I teach the 14th Amendment to my undergraduate criminal justice students at George Washington University. And the 14th Amendment, what it did was it incorporated a whole bunch of rights in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, like a right to a jury trial, a right to effective assistance of counsel, a right against self-incrimination, a right prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, etc. And it imported or incorporated all of those prohibitions into the state criminal justice systems. That's just one example. The 14th Amendment was designed to limit some of what the states could do if it ended up violating the federal Constitution. And so they took that rationale that, wait a minute, the 14th Amendment was not bestowing rights on the states for the first time to, for example, disqualify insurrectionists from holding federal office. And they were careful to say they can still disqualify insurrectionists from holding state office, but Congress is going to have to take up the question of if and how to disqualify candidates from federal office. So they had a number of different rationales as to why the 14th Amendment Section 3 was just not the vehicle to give this right over to the states.
So is this basically an admission that as of right now, and until such time as Congress actually passes a law to be able to enforce the 14th Amendment, that the 14th Amendment is basically null and void at the moment? That Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, barring insurrectionists who've held federal office before from running again, or those who've given aid or comfort to those who've engaged in insurrection, that amendment is basically just null and void for the moment.
That section of the 14th Amendment is null and void unless Congress gets off its duff, works together in a cooperative fashion, immediately passes legislation, and then implements it against who? Donald Trump, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination. So I'm going to stick with your formulation that, yes, in the real world, in Washington, D.C., disqualification is dead.
Okay, well, of course, we still have the immunity case that we were looking forward to. Even if the result of this case is disappointing, I think it is not entirely unsurprising given the composition of this court. But now all eyes turn to the Supreme Court for this immunity case, and again, we have that to look forward to on April 22nd, which yet again was another gift to Donald Trump. So to your earlier point, you and I have spoken about this before, and I think it's worth reiterating because I don't want people to leave this with a sense of hopelessness or despair, but it was never going to be on the courts to swoop in and save us. It was never going to be on lawyers or members of Congress or state parties to swoop in and save us. It has always been our responsibility to figure out how to win this election. And so to Glenn's point before, it's our job to show up as we head toward November and make sure that Donald Trump doesn't win and to not leave all of that responsibility in the hands of lawyers or judges.
Brian, let's leave everybody with a little bit of silver lining lurking behind the big dark orange cloud that is Donald Trump. As you say, the Supreme Court will take up the presidential immunity claim. Donald Trump says he can commit all the crimes he wants against the American people and never be held accountable, never be prosecuted for it. The broad consensus is the Supreme Court will not buy into the president is king argument, and they will reject that claim and return the case to Judge Chutkan so she can put it back on the trial track in D.C. That's his federal prosecution for trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Now, we won't believe it until we see that opinion, in our hot little hands. But the overwhelming consensus is that they were going to let Donald Trump stay on the ballots, but they were also going to let the federal government prosecute Donald Trump for his crimes. That will be the next important sort of benchmark as to whether we have any hope of remaining a viable democracy. So today we took a hit, but I don't want people to think this was the end game, the ninth inning, and everybody's heading into the dugout and we're done. We are far from done because we have another important legal opinion coming from the Supreme Court that we believe will fall our way. When I say our way, democracy's way and justice's way. And then, as we will say probably over and over and over again until November 5th, we are going to fix this problem at the polls. We can, and I believe we will.
We'll leave it there. For everybody watching, if you want to follow along with all of these cases that Trump is contending with and that the Supreme Court is dealing with right now, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.